I'm Margaret Holloway, 73, and for decades I've been the grieving widow who won't let go. My husband James died at Pearl Harbor, and my family, his family, decided my mourning had an expiration date. Enough already, Margaret, they'd say, rolling their eyes when I'd visit his grave or mention his name. They wanted me to move on, remarry, stop being an embarrassment to their perfect family image. But when that FBI agent knocked on my door last Tuesday, everything I thought I knew about James's death and my so-called loving family shattered like glass. The truth they'd been hiding wasn't just about Pearl Harbor. It was about greed, betrayal, and a secret that would expose them all. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt silenced by those who should protect you, like this video. The FBI agent stood on my doorstep like a ghost from another era, his dark suit crisp despite the humid afternoon. Special Agent Reynolds, he'd introduced himself, his voice carrying the weight of official business that made my hands tremble. As I invited him inside, my modest living room suddenly felt smaller with his presence. He declined my offer of tea, instead reaching into his briefcase with practiced efficiency. The manila folder he withdrew looked ordinary enough, but when he opened it, my breath caught in my throat. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to show you something about your husband's military service record." The document he placed before me bore James's name, his photograph from 1941, so young, so hopeful. But as I read the typed lines, confusion clouded my vision, dates that didn't match what I'd been told. Locations I'd never heard the family mention, service assignments that contradicted everything I thought I knew about my husband's final months. "I don't understand," I whispered, my finger tracing the unfamiliar entries. "This says James was stationed in California in November 1941, but his family told me he shipped out to Hawaii in September." Agent Reynolds leaned forward, his expression grave. "Mrs. Holloway, your husband never made it to Pearl Harbor. According to these official records, James Holloway died on December 3, 1941, 4 days before the attack. He was found dead in his barracks in San Francisco." The room began to spin. I gripped the arm of my chair, fighting the nausea that rose in my throat. "That's impossible. The telegram his father received a telegram saying James died heroically at Pearl Harbor. We have his Purple Heart, his commendation, ma'am. I'm sorry to be the one to tell you this, but those documents were falsified. Your husband's death was not what your family claimed it to be." The weight of his words settled over me like a shroud. 73 years old, and I was learning that everything I'd believed about my marriage, my widowhood, my very identity as a Pearl Harbor widow, had been built on lies. Why? The word came out as barely a whisper. Why would they lie about something so terrible? Agent Reynolds closed the folder gently. "Mrs. Holloway, that's exactly what we're trying to find out. Your husband's case has been reopened as part of a broader investigation into wartime irregularities. We have reason to believe that James discovered something that made him a threat to certain interests that included his own family." My mind reeled. The Holloways had been pillars of our community for generations. James's father, Charles, had built a shipping empire that brought prosperity to our small coastal town. The family's wealth and influence had only grown over the decades, their names synonymous with respectability and civic duty. "I need you to understand, Mrs. Holloway, that if our suspicions are correct, your husband may have been murdered to prevent him from exposing a conspiracy that reached the highest levels of government and military contracts." The word murdered hit me like a physical blow. All these years, I'd mourned James as a war hero, a victim of Japanese aggression. The family had encouraged this narrative, building their own legend around their son's sacrifice. "But if Agent Reynolds was right, what do you need from me?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "We need you to help us find the truth, Mrs. Holloway. Your husband left behind evidence, and we believe you may be the key to locating it." After Agent Reynolds left, I sat in my empty living room, staring at the wedding photograph on my mantel. James and I, both so young, so impossibly happy in that captured moment from June 1941. His arm around my waist, my hand on his chest, both of us grinning like we'd discovered the secret to eternal joy. We'd met at a USO dance in the spring of '41. I was 18, working as a secretary at the local bank, living with my parents in a cramped apartment above the hardware store. James was 22, fresh out of college, with his father's confident smile and his mother's gentle eyes. When he asked me to dance, I felt like Cinderella being chosen by the prince. Our courtship was a whirlwind of stolen moments between his training exercises and my work shifts. He'd pick me up in his father's Packard, taking me to dinner at the finest restaurants in town, places I'd only seen from the outside. The Holloway name opened doors I never knew existed, and James seemed to delight in sharing his privileged world with me. "You're different from the other girls," he'd told me one evening as we walked along the harbor, watching the sunset paint the water gold. "You see things clearly. You're not impressed by the things that don't matter." I thought I knew what he meant then. Now, I wondered if he'd been trying to tell me something more. The proposal came in May, just 3 weeks after we'd met. James dropped to one knee in his parents' rose garden, presenting me with a ring that must have cost more than my father made in a year. I said yes because I loved him, but also because I couldn't imagine any other answer when faced with such overwhelming certainty. The wedding was everything I'd dreamed of and nothing I'd expected. The Holloways insisted on handling every detail, transforming our simple ceremony into a grand social event. 200 guests filled the Presbyterian church, including the mayor, the bank president, and half the town council. I felt like I was watching someone else's life unfold. Charles Holloway, James's father, gave a toast at the reception that still echoed in my memory. "To my son James, who has chosen love over convenience, heart over calculation, and to Margaret, who brings joy and authenticity to our family. May your marriage be blessed with truth, honor, and the strength to face whatever challenges lie ahead." At the time, I'd thought his words romantic. Now they felt like a prophecy. James's mother, Eleanor, had been more reserved but equally welcoming. She'd taken me aside after the ceremony, pressing a small wrapped package into my hands. "This belonged to James's grandmother," she'd said softly. "She would have wanted you to have it." Inside was a delicate gold locket, engraved with the words, "Truth above all." I'd worn it every day since. Even now, all these decades later, my fingers found it automatically, tracing the worn inscription. Our honeymoon was brief. Just a weekend in San Francisco before James had to report for extended training. We stayed at the Palace Hotel, played tourists at Fisherman's Wharf, rode the cable cars like children. James seemed different those few days, more serious, more thoughtful. He'd stare out at the harbor for long stretches, and when I asked what he was thinking about, he'd just smile and say, "The future." When we returned, I moved into the Holloway mansion, a sprawling Victorian that had been in the family for 3 generations. My own belongings looked pitiful in the grand rooms, but James had insisted we live there rather than find our own place. "Family is everything," he'd said. "We stick together, especially now with war looking more likely every day." The Holloway shipping business dominated the harbor, with warehouses and docks stretching along the waterfront. Charles had built the company from nothing, starting with a single cargo vessel in 1910 and growing it into a fleet of merchant ships that carried goods up and down the Pacific coast. The war in Europe had been a boon for business. American neutrality meant American ships could still trade with countries that European vessels couldn't reach. James had been groomed to take over the business eventually. But first he wanted to serve his country. "It's the right thing to do," he'd told his father over dinner one evening. "We can't profit from other people's war without being willing to fight ourselves." I'd thought his sentiment noble. Charles had seemed less convinced, but he'd supported his son's decision publicly. Looking back, I wondered what conversations had taken place between them in private. The last time I saw James was October 15, 1941. He'd been home on leave for just 2 days, and we'd spent every moment together. He'd seemed anxious, distracted, asking strange questions about my family, my friends, whether I'd be safe if something happened to him. "Nothing's going to happen to you," I'd insisted, holding him close. "You're going to come home, and we're going to have children, and grow old together." He'd kissed me then, deeply, desperately. "Promise me something, Margaret. If anything ever happens to me, don't trust anyone completely, not even family. Promise me you'll think for yourself." I'd laughed, thinking he was being dramatic. "James Holloway, you're starting to sound like one of those mystery novels I read." But he hadn't laughed. He'd looked at me with an intensity that made my heart race. "Promise me." "I promise," I'd said, meaning it even though I didn't understand why it mattered. 3 weeks later, Charles received the telegram. James had died heroically at Pearl Harbor, defending his country against surprise attack. The family had mourned, publicly, accepting condolences from the entire town. They'd held a memorial service with full military honors, despite having no body to bury. And for 73 years, I'd believed every word of it. Agent Reynolds returned 3 days later, this time with a briefcase full of documents that would shatter my understanding of the family I'd called my own for 7 decades. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to show you something about your late father-in-law. Business dealings during the war," he said, spreading papers across my dining table. "What do you know about Holloway Shipping's government contracts?" I'd always known the business had done well during the war. Most shipping companies had. Charles had been proud of his contribution to the war effort, often mentioning the vital supplies his ships carried to support American forces. But looking at the documents Agent Reynolds had brought, I realized I'd understood nothing about the true scope of the operation. "These are classified military contracts," he explained, pointing to official letterhead that bore the seal of the U.S. Navy. "Your father-in-law's company was awarded exclusive rights to transport sensitive materials along the Pacific coast. Look at the dates. These contracts were signed in September 1941, just weeks before Pearl Harbor." The numbers on the contracts made my head spin. Millions of dollars in guaranteed payments, shipping routes that spanned from San Diego to Seattle, cargo manifests that included everything from ammunition to medical supplies. But it was the final document that made my blood run cold. "This is a private correspondence between Charles Holloway and Admiral Morrison. Dated November 30, 1941, Agent Reynolds said quietly, 7 days before Pearl Harbor. Look at what your father-in-law wrote." The letter was typed on Holloway shipping letterhead, Charles's bold signature at the bottom, but the content was nothing like the patriotic businessman I'd known. Instead, it read like the writing of a man who knew exactly what was coming and was positioning himself to profit from it. "Admiral Morrison," the letter began, "I've received confirmation that our Pacific operations will face significant disruption within the next 2 weeks. I recommend we accelerate the timeline for rerouting our most valuable shipments through alternative channels. The opportunity for exclusive contracts in the aftermath will be substantial, provided we're prepared to act quickly." My hands shook. As I read, this sounds like he knew Pearl Harbor was going to happen. "It gets worse," Agent Reynolds said grimly. He pulled out another document, a shipping manifest, dated December 8, 1941, just 1 day after the attack. "Look at what Holloway Shipping was transporting while the rest of the country was still in shock." The manifest listed cargo that didn't make sense for a country that had just entered war. Instead of military supplies or emergency materials, Charles's ships were carrying luxury goods, art objects, and what appeared to be personal effects belonging to Japanese-American families. "We believe your father-in-law was involved in a conspiracy to profit from the Japanese internment," Agent Reynolds explained. "While families were being rounded up and sent to camps, someone was systematically looting their homes and businesses. Holloway Shipping provided the transportation network to move stolen goods to buyers on the black market." The room felt like it was tilting. Charles Holloway, the man who'd walked me down the aisle when my own father couldn't afford to attend my wedding, the man who'd called me daughter and promised to take care of me always, he'd been stealing from innocent families while they were imprisoned by their own government. "But the business thrived during the war," I said weakly. "Everyone knew that. Charles always said it was because of his patriotic duty. His patriotic duty made him one of the wealthiest men on the West Coast." Agent Reynolds interrupted. By 1945, Holloway Shipping controlled nearly 40% of civilian cargo transport between California and Oregon. The company's assets increased by over 3,000% during the war years. He showed me bank records that documented the flow of money, regular deposits from sources listed only as private sales and commodity transfers, payments to individuals with names that meant nothing to me, but which Agent Reynolds explained were known black market dealers and corrupt military officials. "Your father-in-law wasn't just profiting from the war, Mrs. Holloway. He was actively collaborating with people who were supposed to be the enemy. We've found evidence that he was providing shipping schedules and cargo information to Japanese contacts, helping them avoid certain routes while making sure their allies could intercept valuable shipments." The word treason hung in the air between us, unspoken but understood. I thought of all the community events Charles had hosted, all the war bond drives he'd organized, all the speeches he'd given about supporting our boys overseas. Every bit of it had been a lie, a performance designed to cover up his real activities. "What does this have to do with James?" I asked, though I was beginning to understand. "Your husband discovered what his father was doing," Agent Reynolds said gently. "We found evidence that James had been investigating the family business for months before his death. He'd made copies of shipping manifests, photographed correspondence, even recorded conversations with his father's business associates." He pulled out one final documental letter in James's handwriting, dated November 28, 1941. My heart clenched as I recognized his careful script, the way he always dotted his I's with tiny circles instead of points. "My dearest Margaret," the letter began, "if you're reading this, then something has happened to me, and you need to know the truth about my family. I've discovered that my father is not the man we believed him to be. He's been using our business to help enemies of our country, and I can't stand by and watch it happen. I've gathered evidence that I plan to turn over to the authorities, but I'm afraid of what he might do to stop me. If anything happens to me, please know that I love you more than life itself, and I pray that someday you'll understand why I had to make this choice." Tears blurred my vision as I read James's words. My husband had died trying to do the right thing, and his own family had covered it up to protect their criminal empire. "They killed him," I whispered. "His own father killed him." Agent Reynolds nodded solemnly. "We believe so. And then they used his death to create a cover story that would make them look like patriots instead of traitors. James Holloway, the war hero who died at Pearl Harbor, was worth more to them than James Holloway, the whistleblower who could have destroyed them. The Holloway mansion had been sold decades ago, but Agent Reynolds had obtained a warrant to search the property. The current owners, a young couple who'd bought it as a restoration project, were cooperative once they understood the historical significance of our investigation. I hadn't been inside the house since 1943, when Charles had gently suggested I might be more comfortable in a smaller place. He'd helped me find the modest cottage where I'd lived ever since, even paying the first year's rent. I'd thought it was kindness. Now I understood it was about control, keeping me away from anything that might raise uncomfortable questions. Walking through the familiar rooms felt like entering a time capsule. The new owners had restored much of the original woodwork and fixtures, and memories flooded back with each step. The parlor, where James and I had spent quiet evenings reading together. The dining room, where family meals had been formal affairs with proper china and careful conversation. The library, where Charles had conducted his business meetings behind closed doors. The architectural plans show there should be a storage room behind the library, Agent Reynolds said, consulting a blueprint, but we can't find an entrance. Stared at the familiar bookshelves, remembering something that had puzzled me as a young bride. James used to disappear sometimes when we were reading together. He'd be there one moment, and then gone the next. I always thought he was just going to the bathroom, but my fingers traced the carved molding around the shelves, searching for the mechanism I'd seen James use once when he thought I wasn't looking. Their small brass fitting that turned counterclockwise, the entire bookshelf swung inward with a soft click. Behind it lay a narrow room I'd never seen before. Walls lined with filing cabinets and a desk covered in papers. Agent Reynolds whistled low as he shone his flashlight into the hidden space. "Mrs. Holloway, I think we just found James's evidence room." The air inside was stale but dry, preserving everything exactly as it had been left 73 years. AGO, on the desk, sat a wooden box with my name carved into the lid. "For Margaret, with all my love, James." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, were items I'd thought were lost forever. My wedding ring, the real one, not the simple band the family had given me after his death, claiming the original had been lost with his body. A pearl necklace he'd bought me for our first anniversary, which I'd been told was too valuable to keep during the difficult early years of my widowhood. Photographs of our honeymoon that Eleanor had said were damaged beyond repair. But beneath the personal items lay something more precious, a leather journal filled with James's careful documentation of his father's crimes. Page after page of shipping schedules, cargo manifests, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic betrayal. December 1st, 1941. I read aloud from one entry. Confirmed father's meeting with Tanaka at the warehouse. They discussed rerouting 3 shipments scheduled for military bases. Father accepted payment of $50,000 in cash. I have photographs of the exchange. Agent Reynolds found the photographs James had mentioned, hidden in an envelope marked insurance. The images were grainy but clear enough to identify Charles Holloway, shaking hands with a man in a dark suit. bundles of cash visible on the table between them. James was building a federal case against his own father, Agent Reynolds said admiringly. Look at this, he even documented the location of bank accounts, where the money was being hidden. The journal revealed the extent of Charles's network. Corrupt military officials who provided shipping schedules in advance, black market dealers who purchased stolen goods from Japanese-American families, even connections to actual enemy agents who were using Holloway shipping to gather intelligence about American naval movements. But it was the final entry that broke my heart. December 2, 1941. Father knows, I've been investigating. He confronted me tonight, demanded I turn over any evidence I've collected. I told him I'd already made copies, that it was too late to stop what I'd started. He became violent, threatened Margaret if I didn't cooperate. I can't let him hurt her. I've hidden everything in the safe room, where she'll find it if something happens to me. Tomorrow I go to the FBI. God help me, I hope I'm doing the right thing. He never made it to the FBI, Agent Reynolds said quietly. According to the military records, James was found dead in his barracks on December 3rd, apparently from a heart attack, but he was 22 years old, in perfect health. The attending physician noted irregularities but was ordered not to pursue an investigation. I closed the journal, holding it against my chest. They murdered him, and then they stole his memory. They turned my husband into a hero to cover up their own crimes. Agent Reynolds was examining other documents from the hidden room. Mrs. Holloway, there's something else you need to see. This appears to be your husband's will. Dated November 30th, 1941. The will was in James's handwriting, witnessed by two people whose names I didn't recognize. It was nothing like the document the family had shown me after his death, the one that left everything to his parents, with only a small trust fund for my maintenance. This will left everything to me. Not just James's personal effects, but his share of the family business. His inheritance from his grandparents, even property I'd never known he owned. The estimated value, calculated in $1,941, was staggering. They stole from you, too, Agent Reynolds said, his voice filled with anger. For 73 years, you've been living on scraps while they controlled wealth that was rightfully yours. But the money wasn't what mattered. It was the final paragraph of the will that made me cry. To my beloved wife Margaret, I leave, not just my worldly possessions, but my faith in her strength and courage. If you're reading this, then you've found the truth I died trying to expose. I know you'll use it wisely, and I know you'll never let them win. You are braver than you know, my darling, and I love you beyond measure. I looked around the hidden room, at the evidence of my husband's courage and the family's betrayal. For 73 years, I'd been the grieving widow who wouldn't let go. But James had never wanted me to let go. He'd wanted me to fight. Agent Reynolds, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in decades. What do we do now? He smiled grimly. Now, Mrs. Holloway, we make them pay. Agent Reynolds spread the forged death certificate across my kitchen table, pointing to details I'd never thought to question. The official document that had made me a widow bore all the right seals, all the proper signatures. But under close examination, the lies became obvious. Look at the cause of death, he said, his finger tracing the typed words, killed in action, Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, but the serial numbers don't match any unit that was actually stationed there. The commanding officer listed as signing the certificate was transferred to the Atlantic Theater in October 1941. He was never at Pearl Harbor. I stared at the document that had shaped my entire adult life, the piece of paper that had made me eligible for a widow's pension, that had earned me the sympathy of my community, that had given meaning to my grief. Every word of it was a lie. The real death certificate tells a different story, Agent Reynolds continued, producing another document from his briefcase. James Holloway, deceased December 3, 1941, at the Presidio Army Base in San Francisco. Cause of death, acute poisoning, likely administered through contaminated alcohol. The attending physician noted petechial hemorrhaging consistent with certain plant-based toxins. My hands clenched into fists. They poisoned him. The physician requested an autopsy, but the order was countermanded by a superior officer, one who, according to these financial records we've uncovered, received a substantial payment from Holloway Shipping just days later. The web of corruption was vast and methodical. Charles hadn't just murdered his own son, he'd used his wealth and connections to orchestrate an elaborate cover-up that reached into the highest levels of military command. The Pearl Harbor attack, devastating as it was, had provided the perfect cover story. One more casualty among thousands, one more hero's sacrifice that no one would think to question. But why Pearl Harbor specifically? I asked. Why not just say he died in training? Because Pearl Harbor made him a martyr, Agent Reynolds explained. A training accident would have raised questions, required investigations, but a hero's death in the surprise attack, that was above scrutiny. It made the family look patriotic, turned their son's murder into a symbol of American sacrifice. He showed me newspaper clippings from December 1941, stories about local families who had lost sons in the attack. There was James, featured prominently, in an article titled, "Local Hero Dies Defending Pearl Harbor." Charles had been quoted extensively, speaking about his son's courage and dedication to duty. James always said he'd rather die fighting for his country than live as a coward. I read aloud from Charles's statement to the press. His sacrifice will inspire us all to support the war effort with renewed determination. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Charles had murdered his son to protect his treasonous activities, then used that murder to enhance his own reputation as a patriotic businessman. The community had rallied around the family, offering support and admiration that only increased their social standing. The funeral was the masterstroke, Agent Reynolds said, showing me photographs from the memorial service. Full military honors, despite having no body to bury. The empty casket became a symbol, and the Holloway family became local celebrities. I remembered that day all too clearly, standing in the front pew of the church, accepting condolences from hundreds of people I barely knew. Charles had insisted I wear a black veil, had coached me on what to say to reporters. James would want you to be strong, he'd told me. He'd want you to honor his memory with dignity. Eleanor had been more practical. You're part of this family now, Margaret. We take care of our own, but we also expect loyalty. James is gone, but his legacy lives on through how we remember him. At the time, I'd thought they were helping me cope with grief. Now I understood they were managing a public relations campaign, with me as an unwitting performer in their elaborate deception. The pension payments were another layer of the cover-up. Agent Reynolds continued. The military widow's benefits you've been receiving for 73 years, they're not coming from the government. They're coming from a trust fund established by Holloway Shipping, designed to keep you financially dependent and emotionally invested in the official story. My monthly pension check, the modest sum that had allowed me to maintain my independence all these years, was blood money. Charles had been paying me to remain his son's widow, to preserve the lie that had protected his empire. Even your cottage, Agent Reynolds said gently. It's owned by a subsidiary of what used to be Holloway Shipping. You've never been a tenant, Mrs. Holloway. You've been a kept woman, maintained by the same people who murdered your husband. The room felt like it was closing in around me. Every aspect of my life since James's death had been controlled, manipulated, designed to keep me trapped in a role that served their purposes. The grieving widow who wouldn't let go wasn't a source of embarrassment to the family. I was a living testament to their son's heroism. Proof of the love and loss that made their story credible. How many people knew? I whispered. We're still investigating, but the evidence suggests it was a small circle. Charles, certainly. Eleanor, almost definitely wives. Don't miss that kind of deception. Probably one or two trusted business associates. The beauty of the scheme was that it didn't require many conspirators. Most people genuinely believed the story because they had no reason to doubt it. I thought of all the years I'd spent defending James's memory, arguing with people who suggested I should move on, remarry, build a new life. I'd been proud of my loyalty, convinced that my enduring love was a virtue, but I hadn't been honoring my husband's memory. I'd been perpetuating his murder. There's something else, Agent Reynolds said, his voice even gentler. The Purple Heart and commendation you mentioned. We've traced them. They belonged to a real soldier who died at Pearl Harbor. Private Michael Torres, aged 19. His family never received them because they were stolen and given to you instead. Even James's medals were lies. Somewhere, another family had been denied the recognition their son deserved so that Charles could make his deception more convincing. The scope of the betrayal was overwhelming. Agent Reynolds, I said, my voice steady despite the chaos in my heart. I want to help you destroy them, all of them. I want justice for James, and for everyone else they've hurt. He nodded grimly. Then you should know, Mrs. Holloway, that this is just the beginning. The Holloway family's crimes didn't end with your husband's murder. They've been covering their tracks for 7 decades, and the conspiracy goes deeper than we initially suspected. Elizabeth Holloway still lived in the grand house on Elm Street that Charles had built for his eldest daughter in 1955. At 78, she remained the family matriarch, the keeper of social connections and community reputation. I'd maintained cordial relations with her over the decades, accepting her Christmas cards and occasional invitations to family gatherings, never suspecting that she'd been complicit in her brother's murder. The bank records Agent Reynolds had shown me told a different story than the family's version of financial history. Large deposits had been made to Elizabeth's accounts, starting in December 1941, payments that continued monthly for years afterward. The amounts corresponded exactly with the dates of my pension payments for every dollar I received to maintain my silence. Elizabeth received 10 to maintain hers. I rang her doorbell on a gray Tuesday morning, my hand steady despite the magnitude of what I was about to do. Elizabeth answered the door herself, her silver hair perfectly styled, her pearls gleaming against a navy blue dress that probably cost more than I spent on clothing in a year. "Margaret, dear, what a lovely surprise," she said, her smile as warm and false as it had always been. Come in, come in. I was just having my morning tea." Her living room was a shrine to family history: photographs of Charles in his business suits, Eleanor in her garden club finery, and prominently displayed, a large portrait of James in his army uniform, the image that had been painted from his official military photograph, the handsome young man who'd died heroically at Pearl Harbor. Looking at it now, knowing what I knew, made my stomach turn. "I've been thinking about James lately," I said, accepting the delicate china cup she offered, "about his final days before he shipped out." Elizabeth's smile flickered almost imperceptibly. "Oh, my dear, why torture yourself with such memories? James has been gone for so long. Surely it's time to focus on happier thoughts." "Actually, I've been learning some interesting things about those final days," I continued, watching her face carefully. "Did you know that James never actually made it to Pearl Harbor?" The teacup rattled against its saucer as Elizabeth set it down. "I'm sure. I don't know what you mean. Agent Reynolds from the FBI has been quite helpful in clarifying the timeline," I said, my voice conversational despite the fury building in my chest. "It turns out James died on December 3, 1941, in San Francisco, 4 days before Pearl Harbor. Funny how the family never mentioned that detail." Elizabeth's composure cracked, her face going pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Margaret, I think perhaps you're confused. This Agent Reynolds, are you certain he's legitimate? There are so many scammers these days, preying on elderly people." "He's legitimate," I said firmly. "And so are the bank records showing the payments you've been receiving since 1941. Blood money, Elizabeth, payment for keeping quiet about your brother's murder." The word murder hung in the air between us like a physical presence. Elizabeth stared at me, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly, before finally finding her voice. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You don't know what it was like. The war, the pressure, the impossible choices. I understand that your father killed my husband to protect his own criminal activities," I said, standing up and walking to the mantelpiece where James's portrait hung. "I understand that you all conspired to turn his murder into a heroic death to cover your tracks." Elizabeth rose shakily, her hands trembling as she smoothed her skirt. "James was going to destroy everything. Everything our father built, everything our family represented. He was going to turn father over to the authorities based on some wild theories. Wild theories." I turned to face her, my voice rising. "Elizabeth, your father was committing treason. He was selling information to enemy agents, stealing from innocent families, profiting from human misery, while American boys were dying overseas." "You make it sound so simple," Elizabeth snapped, her mask of gentility finally slipping away. "You have no idea what the pressures were like. Father was trying to protect American interests, trying to ensure that when the war ended, our country would be in a position of strength by collaborating with the Japanese, by being practical." Elizabeth's voice cracked with decades of suppressed guilt and rationalization, "by understanding that wars end, but business relationships endure. Father was thinking about the future, about what would happen after all the fighting stopped." I stared at her, amazed by her ability to reframe treason as patriotism, and James threatened that future. "James was naive," Elizabeth said. her voice quieter now, but no less bitter. He thought the world was black and white, good and evil. He couldn't understand the complexities of real life, the compromises that successful people have to make. So you let your father poison him. Elizabeth flinched as if I'd struck her. I didn't let father do anything. I didn't even know what he was planning until it was too late. By the time I understood what had happened, James was already dead, and father was implementing the cover story. But you went along with it. You helped maintain the lie. What choice did I have? Elizabeth's composure completely crumbled, tears streaming down her cheeks. My brother was dead. Nothing I could do would bring him back. But if the truth came out, it would destroy our entire family. Mother would have been ruined. Our business would have collapsed. Hundreds of employees would have lost their jobs, and you would have lost your comfortable lifestyle. Elizabeth's tears stopped abruptly, replaced by a cold fury I'd never seen before. Don't you dare judge me, Margaret. You've lived off our family's generosity for 73 years. Every penny you've received, every comfort you've enjoyed, has come from the same source you're now condemning. Generosity. I laughed bitterly. You've been paying me hush money to stay quiet about a crime I didn't even know had been committed. We've been taking care of you, Elizabeth insisted. Father could have left you with nothing, turned you out onto the street as soon as James died. Instead, he made sure you were provided for, made sure you had a place in our family. I never had a place in your family, I interrupted. I was a prop in your performance, a living reminder of your son's supposed heroism. You kept me around because I validated your lie. Elizabeth stared at me for a long moment, her face cycling through emotions I couldn't read. Finally, she spoke, her voice deadly quiet. You have no proof of any of this. Wild accusations from a lonely old woman who's probably suffering from dementia. Even if this FBI agent is real, even if he has documents, who's going to believe that a respected family like ours would commit such crimes? We have 73 years of reputation, of community standing, of charitable works and civic contributions. You have the word of a government agent and some old papers that could have been forged by anyone. I smiled, feeling a strength I hadn't experienced in decades. Actually, Elizabeth, I have something much better than that. I have James's own words, in his own handwriting, documenting everything your father did. I have photographs, financial records, and a will that proves everything I've inherited rightfully belongs to me. Most importantly, I have the truth. Elizabeth's face went white. That's impossible. Father destroyed everything. Your father never found James's hiding place. My husband was smarter than all of you gave him credit for. For the first time since I'd known her, Elizabeth Holloway looked truly afraid. Margaret, please. Think about what you're doing. Think about the consequences. This will destroy innocent people. The only innocent person in this story was James, I said, moving toward the door, and you all destroyed him 73 years ago. Now, it's time for justice. Agent Reynolds had requested a meeting at the federal building downtown, and his expression when I arrived told me he'd uncovered something significant. The conference room was filled with documents, photographs, and what appeared to be several decades' worth of financial records spread across multiple tables. Mrs. Holloway, what I'm about to show you is going to be difficult to hear, he began, gesturing for me to sit down. We've been working with forensic accountants to trace your husband's estate, and what we've discovered represents one of the most systematic cases of financial fraud we've ever encountered. He placed James's hidden will beside a document I recognized, the will that had been read to me in Charles's lawyer's office in January 1942. The contrast was stark and damning. According to the authentic will we found in your husband's hiding place, James left you everything, Agent Reynolds explained. His share of Holloway shipping, which in 1941 was valued at approximately $2.3 million. His trust fund from his grandparents, worth another $800,000. Personal property, including real estate, investments, and cash assets totaling nearly $500,000. The numbers were staggering, even accounting for inflation. In 1941, James had been worth nearly $4 million, a fortune that would be worth tens of millions today. The fraudulent will claimed that James had left everything to his parents, with only a small maintenance trust for you. Agent Reynolds continued, but we've now established that this document was entirely fabricated. The witnesses whose signatures appear on it have been traced. Both died in 1940. A full year before this will was supposedly signed. I stared at the forged document that had shaped my entire financial existence. So the family has been stealing from me for 73 years. Worse than that, Agent Reynolds said grimly. They've been actively working to keep you financially dependent, so you wouldn't ask uncomfortable questions. Look at this. He showed me a series of financial statements spanning decades. Every time I'd tried to improve my situation for better jobs, saving money, even considering investments, obstacles had mysteriously appeared, job applications that disappeared, bank loans that were denied despite good credit, investment opportunities that fell through at the last minute. The Holloway family used their influence to systematically sabotage any attempt you made to achieve financial independence. Agent Reynolds explained, they needed you poor enough to be grateful for their generosity, but not so desperate that you'd start asking where the money was coming from. The manipulation had been subtle but comprehensive. Charles had personally vouched for me when I'd rented my cottage, ensuring I got a special rate that I'd thought was kindness. When I'd applied for jobs that would have paid significantly more than my pension, those employers had received calls questioning my stability, my qualifications, even my mental health. Here's a letter from 1963, Agent Reynolds said, showing me a piece of correspondence on legal letterhead. You'd applied for a position as a bookkeeper at the largest accounting firm in town. The firm's managing partner received this note from Charles Holloway's lawyer, expressing concern about hiring a woman who might be emotionally unstable due to unresolved grief. I remembered that job rejection clearly. I'd been so qualified, so hopeful, and the dismissal had been devastating. The managing partner had been apologetic but vague about why they'd chosen someone else. I'd never suspected that my late father-in-law was actively working against me. The pattern continues for decades, Agent Reynolds said, flipping through file after file. Every time you tried to achieve independence, the family intervened. They couldn't risk you becoming successful enough to start asking questions about your financial situation. But it was the final document he showed me that truly demonstrated the scope of their theft. James's share of Holloway shipping had continued to grow throughout the decades, even as the family claimed it had been dissolved and the assets distributed. In reality, the company had been restructured multiple times, always ensuring that James's rightful inheritance remained under family control. Conservative estimates suggest that your husband's estate would be worth approximately $47 million today. Agent Reynolds said quietly, that's what they've stolen from you over the course of 7 decades. The number was almost incomprehensible. $47 million. Enough to have lived comfortably, traveled the world, supported charities, made a real difference in people's lives. Instead, I'd spent my entire adult life worrying about grocery bills and utility payments. There's more, Agent Reynolds continued, producing another set of documents. James had included specific instructions in his will about what should happen if evidence of his father's crimes ever came to light. He established a secondary trust, funded by his inheritance, specifically designed to support other victims of wartime profiteering and corruption. James had thought of everything. Even from beyond the grave, he'd been trying to right the wrongs his family had committed. The trust he'd established would have provided millions of dollars to families who'd been robbed during the Japanese internment, to veterans who'd been cheated out of their benefits, to anyone who'd suffered because of people like Charles Holloway. The family has been aware of this trust for decades, Agent Reynolds said. They've been actively managing it, using the funds for their own purposes while maintaining the legal fiction that it doesn't exist. I thought of all the charity galas the Holloways had hosted over the years, all the community projects they'd funded, all the recognition they'd received for their philanthropy. They'd been generous with money that wasn't theirs, using James's inheritance to build their reputation as civic-minded citizens. Even the cottage you've been living in, Agent Reynolds said gently, according to James's will, it was supposed to be purchased outright and given to you as your permanent home. Instead, they've kept you as a tenant, paying rent on property that should have belonged to you. The cottage I'd thought of as Charles's kindness was actually mine by right. For 73 years, I'd been paying rent to live in my own home. What can we do about it? I asked, surprised by how calm I felt despite the magnitude of the revelation. Legally, the statute of limitations on most financial crimes has expired, Agent Reynolds admitted, but fraud, conspiracy, and murder have no statute of limitations. More importantly, The ongoing nature of the deception means that new crimes have been committed as recently as your last pension payment. He leaned forward, his expression intense. Mrs. Holloway, we can't give you back the 73 years they stole from you, but we can make sure they pay for what they've done, and we can restore what's rightfully yours. The question is, are you prepared for the fight this is going to involve? I looked around the room at the evidence of my family's betrayal, thinking of James's courage in standing up to his father, remembering his final words about never letting them win. Agent Reynolds, I said, my voice stronger than it had been. In decades, I've been preparing for this fight my entire life. I just didn't know it. Thomas Garrett was 87 years old, but his handshake was firm and his eyes sharp as he greeted me in Agent Reynolds's office. He'd driven down from Portland at the FBI's request, bringing with him a manila envelope that had remained unopened for over 7 decades. Mrs. Holloway, he said, his voice carrying the slight tremor of age but none of uncertainty. I've been waiting a long time to meet you. Jimmy talked about you constantly during those final weeks. He loved you more than life itself. Thomas had been James's bunkmate during his final months in the Army, and according to Agent Reynolds, he was the only person still alive who could provide first-hand testimony about my husband's state of mind before his death. Jimmy was scared, Thomas said without preamble, settling into his chair with obvious discomfort. Not of dying in combat, we were all scared of that. He was scared of his own family. He'd discovered something about his father's business that kept him awake at night. Thomas opened the manila envelope with careful, arthritic fingers. Inside was a letter addressed to me in James's handwriting, along with a key and a small photograph. He gave me this on December 1st, 1941, Thomas explained. Made me promise to get it to you if anything happened to him. But when the telegram came saying he'd died at Pearl Harbor, I didn't know how to reach you. By the time I tried to contact the family, they said you'd moved away and didn't want to be disturbed. Another lie. I'd never moved away, never refused contact. The family had simply intercepted any attempts to reach me, ensuring that their version of events remained unchallenged. What did James tell you about his father? Agent Reynolds asked. Thomas's weathered face darkened. That Charles Holloway was a traitor. Jimmy had proof that his father was selling shipping schedules to Japanese contacts, helping them avoid American patrols while they positioned themselves for an attack. He also had evidence that the old man was planning to profit from whatever disaster was coming. The letter Thomas handed me was brief but devastating. My dearest Margaret, if Thomas is giving you this letter, then my worst fears have come to pass. I've discovered that my father is not the patriot he pretends to be. He's actively helping our enemies prepare for an attack on American forces, and when that attack comes, he plans to use the chaos to steal from innocent families. I have evidence hidden where only you can find it. The key in this envelope opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box number 1247. Inside you'll find everything you need to expose the truth. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you from what's coming, but I pray that someday you'll have the strength to finish what I started. All my love, James. The key was small and brass, worn smooth by decades of handling. Thomas had carried it with him for 73 years, waiting for a chance to fulfill his promise to a dead friend. There's something else, Thomas said, producing the photograph. Jimmy took this the night before he died. He said it was insurance. The black and white image showed Charles Holloway in what appeared to be a warehouse, standing beside several large crates, but it wasn't Charles who made my blood run cold. It was the other man in the photograph, the one whose face was clearly visible, as he handed Charles an envelope. That's Takeshi Yamamoto, Agent Reynolds said quietly, a known Japanese intelligence operative who was supposed to have been deported in 1940. According to this photograph, he was still in the country and still meeting with Yorva as late as December 1941. The implications were staggering. Charles hadn't just been profiteering from the war, he'd been actively collaborating with enemy agents in the weeks before Pearl Harbor. The attack that had killed over 2,000 Americans had been aided by information provided by James's own father. Jimmy was going to turn this photograph over to the FBI on December 4th. Thomas continued. He'd already made contact with a federal agent, had an appointment set up, but he never made it to that meeting, because his father found out. I said, the pieces finally falling into place. Thomas nodded grimly. Jimmy called me the night of December 2nd. He was terrified. He said his father had confronted him, demanded he turn over any evidence he'd collected. When Jimmy refused, Charles threatened to hurt you if the information ever became public. Even in his final hours, James had been trying to protect me. His father had used my safety as leverage to try to control his son, but James had been too principled to compromise with treason, even to save his own life. What happened next? Agent Reynolds asked. Jimmy said he was going to hide the evidence somewhere safe. Somewhere his father would never find it, but where Margaret could eventually discover it. He'd already prepared this letter and the bank box, but he wanted to make sure there was a backup plan, the safety deposit box. In all the chaos of James's supposed death and the family's subsequent control over my life, I'd never been told about any bank box. Charles had probably closed it immediately, claiming the contents as part of his son's estate. We checked with the bank, Agent Reynolds said, anticipating my question. The box was indeed closed in January 1942, but the contents were never retrieved. Bank policy required them to be held in storage pending resolution of estate matters. They're still there. After 73 years, James's final evidence was still waiting for me. There's one more thing, Thomas said, his voice growing even more serious. Jimmy wasn't the only one who suspected what Charles was doing. There were other soldiers, other people who'd seen things that didn't add up. But after Jimmy died, most of them were transferred to different units, sent overseas where they couldn't ask uncomfortable questions. A systematic cover-up, Agent Reynolds murmured. More than that, Thomas said. A few of the guys who kept asking questions had accidents, training mishaps, friendly fire incidents, that sort of thing. Nothing that could be proven, but enough to make the rest of us understand that it was healthier to forget what we'd seen. The scope of Charles's conspiracy was becoming clearer. He hadn't just murdered his own son, he'd orchestrated the deaths of anyone who might have exposed his treason. American soldiers had died to protect his secret, their families told they'd died heroically when they'd actually been silenced for asking the right questions. Why are you coming forward now? I asked Thomas, his eyes filled with tears for the first time since we'd met. Because I'm dying, Mrs. Holloway. Cancer. The doctors give me maybe 6 months. I've carried this secret for 73 years, and I can't take it to my grave. Jimmy was my friend, and he deserved better than what happened to him. You deserved better too. Thomas reached across the table and took my hand in both of his. I'm sorry I waited so long. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder to reach you when you were young, and might have had more years to enjoy the truth. But I'm here now, and I'll do whatever it takes to help you get justice. Looking at this brave old man who'd driven 5 hours to keep a promise made to a dead friend, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Thank you, Thomas, I said, squeezing his weathered hands. James chose his friends well. Agent Reynolds gathered the documents, his expression determined. Mrs. Holloway, with Thomas's testimony and James's evidence from the bank box, we have enough to proceed with formal charges. Are you ready to take down the people who destroyed your husband? I thought of James, young and idealistic, dying alone, because he'd tried to do the right thing. I thought of all the years I'd spent mourning a lie while his killers prospered. I thought of Thomas, dying of cancer but still fighting for justice. I'm ready, I said. Let's finish what James started. The legal documents arrived by courier on a Thursday morning, delivered in a thick manila envelope bearing the letterhead of Pemberton, Walsh and Associates, the most expensive law firm in the state. Inside were papers that made my hands shake with rage, a petition to have me declared mentally incompetent, filed by the surviving members of the Holloway family. According to the petition, I was suffering from age-related dementia and delusional thinking, evidenced by my recent claims of family conspiracy and false accusations against deceased family members. The document painted me as a confused, elderly woman whose grip on reality had deteriorated to the point where I posed a danger to myself and others. Elizabeth Holloway had signed as the primary petitioner, supported by affidavits from 2 of James's surviving cousins and a doctor I'd never met who claimed to have observed clear signs of cognitive decline during a recent evaluation. The evaluation they referenced had never taken place. Agent Reynolds studied the documents with professional interest. When I called him in a panic, "This is actually a good sign, Mrs. Holloway. It means they're scared. Filing false medical claims is a federal crime, and doing it to silence a witness in an ongoing investigation adds conspiracy charges to their list of problems." But the immediate threat was real. If the court granted the petition, I would be declared incompetent and placed Under the guardianship of Elizabeth Holloway, she would control my finances, my medical decisions, even where I lived. Worse, my testimony in the federal case would be dismissed as the ravings of a mentally ill woman. "They've done this before," Agent Reynolds said grimly. "We've found records of at least 3 other people over the decades who tried to raise questions about the family's wartime activities. All of them were eventually declared incompetent or committed to mental institutions." The pattern was chilling. In 1954, a former Holloway Shipping employee had tried to go public with evidence of the company's illegal activities. Within 6 months, he'd been declared mentally unstable and committed to a state hospital, where he died 2 years later. In 1967, a Japanese-American family had attempted to file suit over stolen property. The family patriarch had been declared incompetent just before the trial date, and the case had been dismissed. "They've perfected the system," Agent Reynolds explained. "Use their influence to have inconvenient people declared mentally ill, then use that declaration to invalidate anything those people might say against them." The hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving us almost no time to prepare a defense. But Agent Reynolds had resources I hadn't expected. "We're going to fight this with their own weapons," he said, introducing me to Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specialized in cases involving elder abuse and legal coercion. Dr. Chen has been following the Holloway family's activities for years as part of her research into systematic psychological manipulation. Dr. Chen was a small, intense woman in her 50s whose examination of me was thorough but gentle. She administered cognitive tests, reviewed my medical history, and conducted extensive interviews about my life and recent experiences. "Mrs. Holloway, you are demonstrably not suffering from dementia or any other form of cognitive decline," she told me after completing her evaluation. "Your memory is exceptional, your reasoning is sound, and your emotional responses are entirely appropriate to the traumatic revelations you've recently experienced." But Dr. Chen's most important contribution was her analysis of the Holloway family's psychological tactics. "What you've experienced is a textbook case of long-term psychological manipulation designed to maintain control over a vulnerable individual. The family has used financial dependency, social isolation, and emotional manipulation to keep you trapped in a state of learned helplessness." She showed me research papers documenting similar cases, other families who'd used systematic psychological abuse to silence potential witnesses or maintain control over inconvenient relatives. The Holloways weren't unique, they were just particularly skilled practitioners of a well-established pattern of abuse. "The competency petition they've filed shows classic signs of gaslighting," Dr. Chen continued. "They're trying to make you question your own perceptions and memories by suggesting that your entirely rational responses to their deception are evidence of mental illness." The day of the hearing arrived with unseasonable rain, turning the courthouse steps slippery and treacherous. Elizabeth Holloway arrived with an entourage that included her lawyer, 2 family members I barely recognized, and the mysterious doctor who'd supposedly evaluated me. Dr. Marcus Thornfield looked exactly like Central Casting's idea of a distinguished physician: silver hair, expensive suit, the kind of confident bearing that impressed juries. When Agent Reynolds ran his background, we discovered that Dr. Thornfield had been on the Holloway family's payroll for over 20 years, providing medical consultations that invariably supported whatever legal position the family needed. "Your Honor," Elizabeth's lawyer began, "we're here today out of genuine concern for Mrs. Holloway's welfare. Family members have observed increasing signs of paranoid delusions, including wild accusations against deceased relatives and claims of elaborate conspiracies spanning decades." The lawyer, a sharp-faced woman named Patricia Walsh, painted a picture of me as a lonely widow whose mind had finally snapped under the weight of decades-long grief. According to her version of events, I'd become obsessed with conspiracy theories, influenced by con artists posing as federal agents, and was now making increasingly dangerous accusations against the family that had supported me for over 70 years. "Mrs. Holloway's delusions have escalated to the point where she believes her late husband was murdered by his own father," Walsh continued, her tone suggesting that such a belief was obviously insane. "She claims to have found evidence of wartime treason, despite the fact that Charles Holloway was a respected businessman who contributed significantly to the American war effort." Dr. Thornfield's testimony was smooth and convincing. He spoke about age-related cognitive decline, the tendency for elderly people to develop paranoid fantasies, and the particular vulnerability of isolated widows to manipulation by criminals targeting seniors. He'd never actually examined me, but he presented his assessment with such authority that I could see doubt creeping into the judge's expression. In my professional opinion, Dr. Thornfield concluded, Mrs. Holloway represents a clear case of paranoid dementia complicated by what appears to be elder abuse by individuals seeking to exploit her diminished capacity for financial gain. It was a masterful performance, turning my accusations against the family into evidence of my own mental illness, while simultaneously suggesting that Agent Reynolds was somehow exploiting me. If I hadn't known the truth, I might have believed it myself. But then, it was our turn to present evidence. Agent Reynolds took the stand first, his federal credentials and calm professionalism immediately shifting the courtroom's atmosphere. He methodically presented the evidence we'd gathered: the forged death certificate, the hidden room in the mansion, James's authentic will, and the financial records showing decades of systematic theft. Your Honor, Mrs. Holloway isn't suffering from delusions, Agent Reynolds stated firmly. She's the victim of one of the most elaborate criminal conspiracies we've ever investigated. The Holloway family has spent 73 years covering up murder, treason, and massive financial fraud. This competency petition is simply their latest attempt to silence a witness. Dr. Chen's testimony was devastating to the family's case. She presented her complete psychological evaluation, including cognitive tests that clearly demonstrated my mental competence. More importantly, she explained how the family's behavior toward me fit established patterns of psychological abuse and manipulation. The Holloway family has maintained control over Mrs. Holloway through a sophisticated system of financial dependency, social isolation, and emotional manipulation, Dr. Chen testified. Her recent willingness to challenge their authority represents not mental illness, but rather a healthy psychological response to learning the truth about her situation. The final blow came when Thomas Garrett took the stand. Despite his age and obvious illness, his testimony about James's final days was clear, compelling, and supported by physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed as delusion. I've carried James Holloway's final letter for 73 years, Thomas said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute truth. His father murdered him to cover up treason, and this family has been lying about it ever since. Mrs. Holloway isn't crazy. She's the first person brave enough to demand justice. The judge's ruling was swift and decisive. The petition for incompetency is denied. Furthermore, this court finds that the petition was filed in bad faith, apparently, as an attempt to silence Mrs. Holloway's participation in a legitimate federal investigation. I'm referring this matter to the district attorney for investigation of potential perjury and filing of false legal documents. As we left the courthouse, Elizabeth Holloway grabbed my arm with desperate strength. Margaret, please, think about what you're doing. You're destroying everything: the family name, the business, the community's respect. For what? James is dead. Nothing you do will bring him back. I looked at her with pity rather than anger. Elizabeth, I'm not trying to bring James back. I'm trying to honor his memory by finishing what he died trying to do, exposing the truth about your family's crimes. The truth. Elizabeth laughed bitterly. The truth is that we took care of you for 73 years. We gave you a home, a pension, a place in our family, and this is how you repay us. You didn't take care of me, I said quietly. You managed me. You kept me dependent and isolated so I couldn't ask questions about your lies. That's not family, that's imprisonment. Elizabeth's face crumpled, and for a moment I saw not the manipulative matriarch but a frightened old woman whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. It's too late now, she whispered. Even if you win, even if you destroy us all, it won't give you back the life you lost. She was right about that. Nothing could give me back the 73 years I'd spent living a lie, but maybe, just maybe, I could ensure that James's sacrifice finally meant something. The safety deposit box at First National Bank had been sealed for 73 years, waiting in the basement vault like a tomb holding the last words of the dead. The key Thomas had carried all these decades felt warm in my palm as Agent Reynolds and I descended the narrow stairs to the bank's oldest section. The box itself was larger than I'd expected, its brass fittings green with age. When the bank manager turned both keys mine and the bank's master, the mechanism clicked with a sound like bones settling. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth that had preserved them perfectly, were the final pieces of James's case against his father. The first item was a leather portfolio containing photographs that made my stomach turn. Charles Holloway meeting with men I didn't recognize in what appeared to be various warehouses and docks, money changing hands, documents being exchanged. But it was the final photograph that took my breath away. Charles standing beside a truck, loaded with household goods, Japanese-American families visible in the background being loaded onto buses. He was stealing from them as they were being taken to the camps. I whispered, my voice barely audible in the small vault room. Agent Reynolds examined the photographs with professional interest. These show systematic looting operations. Look at the dates on the back, December 1941 through March 1942. Your father-in-law was profiting from one of the darkest chapters in American history. But James had documented more than just the theft. The portfolio contained shipping manifests, showing how the stolen goods had been transported and sold, bank records tracing the profits, and correspondence with buyers who knew exactly what they were purchasing. Charles hadn't just been an opportunistic thief, he'd been running a sophisticated criminal enterprise. The second item in the box was a thick envelope marked for Margaret's eyes, only in James's careful handwriting. Inside was a letter that brought tears to my eyes before I'd read the first paragraph. My beloved wife, it began. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened. And I've failed to stop my father's crimes before they destroyed our family. I'm writing this on December 2nd, 1941. And I fear it may be my last chance to tell you the truth about what I've discovered. James had known he was in danger, but he'd documented everything anyway, driven by a sense of justice that had ultimately cost him his life. The letter detailed meetings he'd witnessed, conversations he'd overheard, and evidence he'd painstakingly gathered over months of investigation. Father isn't just stealing from Japanese families, James had written. He's providing shipping schedules to enemy agents, helping them position themselves for an attack on American forces. I have proof that he knows something terrible is coming, and he's positioning himself to profit from it. I can't stand by and watch American soldiers die because of my father's greed. The letter went on to describe Charles's network of corrupt military officials, black market dealers, and actual enemy agents. James had been building a federal case that would have exposed not just his father, but an entire conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and military command. I've hidden copies of everything in multiple locations, the letter continued. The evidence in this box is just one set. I've also prepared packages for federal investigators, newspaper reporters, and congressional representatives. If something happens to me, I've arranged for the truth to come out eventually, no matter how hard Father tries to cover it up. But Charles had been more thorough than James had anticipated. By murdering his son and creating the Pearl Harbor cover story, he'd managed to intercept and destroy most of the evidence before it could reach its intended recipients. Only this box had remained hidden, protected by a promise between friends. The third item was the most damning, a recording device that James had somehow managed to conceal during a meeting between Charles and his co-conspirators. The technology was primitive by today's standards, but the voices were clear enough to understand every treasonous word. Agent Reynolds connected the ancient recording device to a modern speaker system, and suddenly Charles Holloway's voice filled the small vault room, as cold and calculating as if he were standing beside us. The attack will come within a week, Charles was saying. Our contacts have confirmed December 7th as the most likely date. We need to make sure our most valuable inventory is moved to secure locations before then. Another voice, one I didn't recognize, responded, "What about your son? He's been asking too many questions." "James won't be a problem much longer," Charles replied with chilling casualness. "I've already made arrangements. By the time the attack happens, he'll be in no position to interfere with our operations." The recording continued for nearly an hour, documenting plans for systematic looting, arrangements for hiding stolen goods, and worst of all, discussions about which American military positions would be most vulnerable during the coming attack. Charles hadn't just known about Pearl Harbor in advance, he'd been actively helping the enemy plan it. This recording alone is enough to posthumously convict Charles Holloway of treason. Agent Reynolds said, his voice tight with control. "Anger. Your husband died trying to prevent one of the most devastating attacks in American history, but the final item in the box was perhaps the most important for my personal situation, a complete inventory of everything James owned, along with detailed instructions for recovering assets that Charles would try to hide or steal after his son's death." Margaret, James had written in a note attached to the inventory. I know father will try to cheat you out of everything I'm leaving you. He'll claim the family business is worthless, that my inheritance has been spent, that there's nothing left for you. Don't believe him. I've prepared this list so you'll know exactly what belongs to you. And I've included information about accounts and investments that father doesn't know about. The list was staggering. In addition to his share of Holloway shipping, James had been quietly building his own investment portfolio, purchasing real estate under assumed names, and even establishing bank accounts in other cities where Charles couldn't access them. The total value of these hidden assets, even in $1,941, was enormous. He was planning to leave his father's business entirely, I realized, reading through James's notes about his secret investments. He was building his own life, independent of the family, and he was making sure you'd be financially independent too, Agent Reynolds added, studying the property deeds and bank account information. Even if he'd lived, he was planning to make sure you never had to depend on his family for anything. The irony was bitter. James had died trying to protect me from his family's manipulation, but his death had delivered me directly into their hands. For 73 years, I'd been living as their dependent, while sitting on a fortune that could have made me one of the wealthiest women in the state. What happens now? I asked, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what we'd discovered. Agent Reynolds carefully repacked James's evidence, his expression grim with determination. Now we use this to destroy everyone who was involved in your husband's murder. And we make sure you finally get everything that was stolen from you. As we left the bank, I carried James's final letter pressed against my heart. After all these years, I finally understood the full scope of his courage and the price he'd paid for trying to do what was right. Now it was my turn to finish what he'd started. Among all the evidence James had hidden, his final letter to me was the most difficult to read and the most precious to possess. I sat in my living room that evening, Agent Reynolds having respectfully left me alone to process everything we'd discovered, and read my husband's last words by the light of the same lamp where I'd spent decades mourning his loss. The letter was longer than the one Thomas had carried, more intimate, written in the careful script that had once penned love notes and grocery lists and mundane reminders about household repairs. But these words carried the weight of a man who knew he was about to die for his principles. My dearest Margaret, James had written, I'm sitting in our bedroom as I write this, watching you sleep, and my heart is breaking because I know I may never see you peaceful like this again. Tomorrow I go to the FBI with everything I've discovered about father's crimes, and I'm terrified of what he might do to stop me. The date at the top of the letter was December 2nd, 1941, the night before James died. He'd spent his final hours not plotting revenge or escape, but thinking about me, about our future together, about the life we'd never have. I need you to understand why I have to do this, the letter continued. I've learned that father has been helping enemy agents plan an attack on Pearl Harbor. American soldiers are going to die, thousands of them, and I have information that could prevent it or at least minimize the damage. I can't live with myself if I don't try to stop it, even if it means destroying my own family. James had known. He'd known about Pearl Harbor in advance, had proof of his father's collaboration with enemy agents, and had died trying to warn the authorities. The attack that had changed the course of World War II might have been prevented, or at least blunted, if James had lived long enough to deliver his evidence. Father confronted me tonight, James wrote. He knows I've been investigating him, and he knows I have evidence. He tried to bribe me, first offered me control of the entire shipping business if I'd just forget what I'd seen. When I refused, he threatened you. He said that if I went to the authorities, he'd make sure you paid the price for my betrayal of family. The manipulation had started even before James's death. Charles had understood his son well enough to know that threatening me would be more effective than threatening James himself. But he'd misjudged his son's character. James had been willing to die rather than let his father's crimes continue. I've made arrangements to protect you as much as possible. The letter continued. The evidence is hidden in multiple locations, and I've prepared detailed instructions for recovering everything that should be yours if something happens to me. But more than that, I've tried to ensure that the truth about father's crimes will eventually come to light, no matter what lies he tells about my death. James had been planning for this possibility for weeks, methodically documenting everything, creating backup plans, trying to anticipate every way his father might try to cover up the truth. But he'd been fighting against forces far more powerful and ruthless than he'd realized. If you're reading this letter, then Father has probably told you, I died heroically at Pearl Harbor. James wrote with heartbreaking Don't believe him. Don't believe any of them. I love you too much to let you live a lie for the rest of your life. Promise me that you'll search for the truth, that you'll fight for what's right, that you'll never let them make you feel small, or helpless, or dependent. The words blurred as tears filled my eyes. James had known exactly what his family would do to me, had predicted their strategy of control and manipulation with devastating accuracy. Even from beyond the grave, he'd been trying to protect me, to give me the strength to fight back. I want you to know that every moment of our marriage has been perfect, the letter continued. You've made me happier than I ever dreamed possible, and you've made me a better man than I would have been without you. If I die tomorrow, I'll die knowing that I was loved completely by the most wonderful woman in the world. I pressed the letter to my chest, finally understanding the magnitude of what had been stolen from us. Not just James's life, not just my inheritance, but the chance to build a real marriage, to have children, to grow old together. Charles had murdered not just his son, but our entire future. There's something else I need you to know, James had written in his final paragraphs. I've been building a case, not just against Father, but against the entire network of people who've been profiting from this war. There are military officers, government officials, businessmen, dozens of them, who've been selling out their own country for money. Father is just one part of a much larger conspiracy. The scope of the corruption James had uncovered was staggering. He'd been documenting a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American government and military command. A network of traitors who'd been using the war to enrich themselves while American soldiers died. I know this is too much to ask of you, the letter concluded, but if the opportunity ever arises, please help bring these people to justice. They've betrayed everything our country stands for, and they deserve to pay for their crimes. But more than that, the families they've hurt deserve to know the truth. James's final words were a promise and a prophecy. I believe that someday, when you're strong enough and brave enough, you'll find a way to expose them all. You're more courageous than you know, my darling, and I have faith that justice will prevail in the end. All my love, forever and always, James. I folded the letter carefully, my hands steady, despite the tears on my cheeks. For 73 years, I'd been mourning James as a victim, but he hadn't been a victim, he'd been a hero who died fighting for justice, fighting to protect innocent people from his father's greed and cruelty. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Agent Reynolds' voice was tight with excitement. When I answered, Mrs. Holloway, we've been analyzing the recording from the safety deposit box. The voice analysis confirms that several of the men talking with your father-in-law were high-ranking military officials who were supposed to be investigating war profiteering, not participating in it. This evidence implicates people we never suspected were involved. I looked at James's letter, thinking about his final request for justice, not just for himself, but for all the families who'd been betrayed by men like his father. Agent Reynolds, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in decades, I want to help you destroy all of them. Every single person who profited from my husband's murder. Every person who betrayed their country while American boys were dying overseas. James died trying to stop them, and I'm going to finish what he started. There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, then Agent Reynolds spoke with quiet respect. Mrs. Holloway, I think your husband would be very proud of you. As I hung up the phone, I felt James's presence more clearly than I had since the day he'd left for his final assignment. He wasn't gone, he was with me, giving me the courage to fight for truth and justice. Just as he'd always believed I could. The war James had started against his father's corruption was finally going to end. And this time, the good guys were going to win. The Holloway family portrait had hung in the main hallway of the mansion for generations. A formal oil painting showing Charles and Eleanor in their prime, surrounded by their children. James stood slightly apart from the others. I now realized, his expression more serious than his siblings, as if he'd already sensed something wrong with the family he'd been born into. I stood before that portrait now, in the mansion's grand foyer, waiting for the family meeting that Agent Reynolds had arranged. The current owners had graciously allowed us to use their home for this confrontation. Understanding the historical significance of what was about to unfold, Elizabeth arrived first, leaning heavily on a walker, her usual perfect grooming showing signs of strain. Behind her came Robert Holloway, Charles's nephew, now in his 70s and still managing what remained of the family business. Margaret Holloway Davidson, James's youngest cousin, completed the group. Three people who represented the last of a family that had built its fortune on blood and betrayal. They'd come because Agent Reynolds had made it clear this meeting was not optional. Federal warrants were being prepared, based on evidence that implicated the entire family in an ongoing conspiracy to conceal murder and treason. This was their last chance to cooperate before formal charges were filed. "I want you all to understand what we're here to discuss," I said, my voice calm despite the fury in my heart. "We're here to talk about how your family murdered my husband and spent 73 years covering it up." Robert laughed nervously. "Margaret, for God's sake, you can't be serious. James died at Pearl Harbor. Everyone knows that. James died on December 3, 1941, poisoned by his own father to prevent him from exposing a massive treason conspiracy," I replied, pulling out the photographs from the safety deposit box. "These pictures show Charles meeting with Japanese agents, planning attacks on American forces." I spread the evidence across the mahogany table where family meetings had been held for decades. Financial records showing payments to enemy agents, shipping manifests documenting the theft of goods from Japanese-American families, and most damning of all, the recording of Charles planning James's murder with his co-conspirators. The color drained from Elizabeth's face as she recognized her father's voice on the recording. "Where did you get this?" "From James. He documented everything before your father killed him." I played a section of the recording where Charles explicitly discussed eliminating his son as a threat. The room fell silent except for the sound of voices from the past. "Planning murder with casual efficiency." Margaret began crying quietly. "I don't understand. Uncle Charles was a war hero. He helped the American war effort. He helped the Japanese plan Pearl Harbor." I interrupted. "He sold shipping schedules that allowed enemy agents to position themselves for maximum damage. Your uncle was directly responsible for the deaths of over 2,000 American soldiers." Robert tried to maintain his composure, but sweat beaded on his forehead. "Even if any of this were true, which I'm not saying it is, what does it have to do with us? We weren't even born when most of this supposedly happened." "You've been part of the cover-up your entire lives," Agent Reynolds said, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "You've all received money from trusts established with funds stolen from Japanese-American families. You've all participated in maintaining the false narrative about James's death. Most importantly, you've all been involved in the systematic financial abuse of Mrs. Holloway." He produced bank records showing decades of payments to family members, all funded by money that rightfully belonged to me. Elizabeth alone had received over $3 million in family support payments since 1941. Money that had been stolen from James's estate. "We took care of Margaret," Elizabeth said weakly. "We made sure she had a place to live, money to survive. You kept me imprisoned," I said, my voice rising for the first time. "You made sure I stayed poor and dependent so I wouldn't ask questions about where my husband's money had gone. You turned me into a performing seal, the grieving widow whose endless mourning proved your story about James's heroic death." I stood up, walking around the table to face each of them directly. "Do you have any idea what it's like to spend 73 years mourning a lie? To build your entire identity around grief for a man whose real death you helped cover up?" Marguerite looked up at me with tears streaming down her face. "We didn't know. When we were children, we just knew that James had died in the war and that the family took care of his widow. We didn't know about any conspiracy." "You knew enough," I said firmly. "You knew that I was kept on an allowance while the family lived in luxury. You knew that I was discouraged from remarrying, from traveling, from making friends outside the family circle. You participated in my isolation even if you didn't understand the reason for it." Robert made one last attempt at defiance. "You can't prove any of this in court. It's all ancient history, hearsay, accusations against dead people who can't defend themselves." Agent Reynolds smiled grimly. "Actually, Mr. Holloway, we can prove all of it. The evidence James left behind is comprehensive and corroborated by multiple sources. More importantly, the ongoing nature of the financial fraud means that recent crimes have been committed. Crimes that are very much within the statute of limitations." He pulled out a thick folder of legal documents. "These are federal indictments for conspiracy, fraud, elder abuse, and accessory after the fact to murder." The grand jury voted to indict all three of you yesterday." The room erupted in shocked voices, denials, and desperate attempts at negotiation. But I wasn't interested in their panic. I walked back to the family portrait, looking up at James's painted face, remembering the young man who died trying to do what was right. "James tried to warn you," I said, my voice cutting through their noise. In his final letter, he begged his father to stop, to think about the consequences of what he was doing. He offered to keep quiet about the past if Charles would just stop helping the enemy. But your father chose money over his son's life, chose profit over his country's safety. I turned back to face them, these three old people whose comfortable lives had been built on blood and lies. James died believing that truth and justice would eventually prevail. He trusted that someday, someone would be brave enough to expose what you've all been hiding. Elizabeth looked up at me with desperate eyes. "Margaret, please, think about what you're doing. We're all old now. This will destroy what's left of our family, ruin our grandchildren's futures. Is revenge really worth all that pain?" "This isn't revenge," I said quietly. "This is justice. There's a difference, even if you can't see it." Agent Reynolds began reading their rights as federal marshals entered the room to make the arrests. As the handcuffs clicked around Elizabeth's wrists, she looked at me one final time. "James would be ashamed of you," she said bitterly. "He loved his family, despite everything. He wouldn't have wanted this." I thought of James's final letter. His plea for justice, not just for himself, but for all the families who'd been betrayed by people like his father. "Elizabeth," I said, "James died trying to stop people like you. I think he'd be proud that I finally found the courage to finish what he started." As they were led away, I remained standing before the family portrait, finally understanding that the young man in the painting hadn't just been my husband, he'd been a hero, whose sacrifice was finally being honored. The war between truth and lies was over, and truth had won. The federal courthouse buzzed with activity. As news of the Holloway indictments spread through our small coastal town, reporters from major newspapers had descended on what they were calling one of the most significant World War II-era conspiracy cases ever prosecuted, and I found myself at the center of a media storm I'd never anticipated. Agent Reynolds had prepared me for the attention. But seeing my photograph on the front page of the New York Times under the headline, "Widow's 73-year fight for justice exposes Pearl Harbor conspiracy," still came as a shock. The article described me as a remarkable woman whose persistence in seeking truth has uncovered one of the most elaborate cover-ups in American history. The federal indictments were comprehensive and damning. Elizabeth, Robert, and Margaret faced charges including conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, money laundering, and accessory after the fact to murder. But the investigation had expanded far beyond the Holloway family, encompassing military officials, government contractors, and financial institutions that had participated in the decades-long cover-up. U.S. Attorney Sarah Martinez had been assigned to prosecute the case, and her reputation for pursuing complex white-collar conspiracies made her the perfect choice to handle the sprawling web of corruption James had documented. When she met with me to prepare for testimony, her first words were an apology. "Mrs. Holloway, on behalf of the United States government, I want to apologize for the failure of our institutions to protect you and seek justice for your husband's murder. What happened to you represents a catastrophic breakdown of the systems that should have ensured the truth came to light decades ago." The government's case was built around three main themes: the original conspiracy that led to James's murder, the systematic cover-up that followed, and the ongoing financial crimes committed to maintain the deception. Each element was supported by overwhelming evidence, much of it in James's own handwriting or voice. The first major break in the case came when Margaret and Holloway Davidson agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed details about the family's internal operations that even Agent Reynolds hadn't suspected. The family had regular meetings about managing Margaret. She testified, her voice barely audible in the packed courtroom. Every year, they would review her situation, discuss whether she was asking too many questions, whether she needed to be moved to a different house or given a different doctor. Margaret's cooperation led to the discovery of additional evidence, including recorded phone conversations from the 1960s and 1970s where family members discussed various strategies for maintaining control over my life. The recordings were chilling in their casual cruelty, discussing me as if I were a problem to be managed rather than a human being deserving of truth and dignity. The prosecution's star witness, however, was Thomas Garrett, whose testimony about James's final days brought the courtroom to tears. Despite his declining health, Thomas insisted on taking the stand to honor his promise to a dead friend. "James Holloway was the bravest man I ever knew," Thomas said, his voice steady despite his obvious physical frailty. "He chose to risk everything, his life, his family, his future, to stop people who were betraying their own country. The fact that his family turned his murder into a lie about heroism is the most disgusting thing I've ever encountered." The defense attorneys attempted to discredit Thomas's testimony by pointing to his age and illness, but the physical evidence he'd preserved for 7 decades spoke louder than any cross-examination. The letter he'd carried, the photographs James had taken, the key to the safety deposit box, all of it corroborated his account perfectly. Elizabeth Holloway's testimony, when she finally took the stand in her own defense, was a masterclass in self-deception and rationalization. She continued to insist that the family had acted out of love and protection, that keeping me ignorant of the truth had been a kindness rather than a cruelty. "Margaret was so young when James died," Elizabeth said, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "We thought it would be kinder to let her believe he died heroically rather than burden her with the ugly truth about family business." But under cross-examination, her story fell apart completely. Prosecutor Martinez methodically walked through decades of financial records, showing how Elizabeth had personally profited from the conspiracy while keeping me in poverty. "Ms. Holloway, you testified that your family acted out of kindness toward Mrs. Holloway. Can you explain why this kindness included paying yourself $3 million over 70 years, while keeping her on a subsistence-level allowance?" Elizabeth's answered that family members deserved compensation for the burden of taking care of me, demonstrated a level of entitlement that shocked even seasoned court observers. The trial's most dramatic moment came when Agent Reynolds played the complete recording James had made of his father's final meeting with enemy agents. The courtroom listened in absolute silence as Charles Holloway's voice, clear and unrepentant, discussed plans for profiting from Pearl Harbor and eliminating his son as a threat. "The boy has become a liability," Charles could be heard saying. "He's too idealistic, too naive to understand the realities of business. I've tried reasoning with him, but he's determined to destroy everything I've built. We'll have to take permanent action." The recording continued for over an hour, documenting not just plans for James's murder, but detailed discussions of how the Pearl Harbor attack would provide cover for massive theft and profiteering. By the time it ended, several jurors were visibly shaken, and Elizabeth was sobbing uncontrollably. The verdict, when it came after 3 days of deliberation, was comprehensive and unanimous. Elizabeth was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Robert received 12 years, and Margaret, thanks to her cooperation, received 5 years probation and community service. But the criminal convictions were only part of the justice James had sought. The civil lawsuit that followed resulted in the complete restoration of my inheritance, plus damages that reflected 7 decades of theft and manipulation. The final settlement, approved by a federal judge, awarded me over $60 million, money that had been stolen from me and invested by the family over the course of my entire adult life. As I left the courthouse after the sentencing, reporters crowded around asking how I felt about finally receiving justice after so many years. The question was harder to answer than they probably expected. "Justice delayed is justice denied," I said, thinking of James and all the years we'd lost to his family's lies. "But justice served, even late, is still justice. My husband died trying to expose the truth, and today that truth has finally been acknowledged." A young reporter asked if I felt vindicated by the outcome. I looked back at the courthouse where 3 members of the Holloway family had just been sentenced for their crimes against James and me. "I don't feel vindicated," I said quietly. "I feel free." The newspaper headlines told the story in stark black and white. Local business dynasty built on murder and treason and Pearl Harbor conspiracy exposed after 73 years. But the real story was in the smaller articles, the letters to the editor, and the conversations happening in coffee shops and grocery stores throughout our community. Our town had been built around the Holloway name for generations. The family had donated the library, funded the hospital wing, sponsored Little League teams and scholarship programs. Streets were named after them, The annual Founders' Day celebration had always featured a memorial to James Holloway, the local war hero who died at Pearl Harbor. Now, all of that history had to be re-examined through the lens of truth. The initial reaction was disbelief. How could a family that had been so generous, so prominent, so apparently patriotic, have been founded on such horrific crimes? The cognitive dissonance was too great for many people to accept immediately. "I just can't believe it," said Martha Richardson, who had worked at the Holloway-funded community center for 30 years. Her quote in the local newspaper captured the sentiment of many longtime residents. "Charles Holloway paid for my daughter's cancer treatment when our insurance wouldn't cover it. How can someone who did so much good have done something so evil?" But as more details emerged from the trial coverage, as journalists dug deeper into the family's history, a different picture began to emerge. The Holloways' generosity hadn't been altruism, had been a sophisticated public relations campaign designed to build the kind of community standing that made their lies unquestionable. Dr. Michael Chen, a historian at the local college, wrote a series of articles examining the family's charitable giving through the lens of their criminal activities. His research revealed that the Holloways had systematically donated stolen money to causes that would enhance their reputation while ensuring community dependence on their continued generosity. The family's philanthropy was essentially a operation, Dr. Chen wrote. They stole millions from Japanese American families and other wartime victims, then donated portions of those funds to local causes in their own name. They literally bought the community's loyalty with other people's money. The revelation that even the family's good deeds had been tainted by criminality was devastating for many residents. But it also opened space for a more honest conversation about complicity and willful blindness. Some of the most powerful responses came from other elderly residents who admitted they'd always had suspicions about the official story of James's death. Eleanor Prasad, now 91, wrote a letter to the editor that was reprinted in newspapers across the country. "I was a young Army nurse in 1941, she wrote. "I knew the boys who were stationed at Pearl Harbor. And I knew something didn't add up about James Holloway's supposed death there. But the family was so powerful, so respected, that questioning their story seemed impossible. I've carried that doubt for 73 years, and I'm ashamed that I didn't speak up when it might have made a difference." Eleanor's letter inspired others to come forward with their own suppressed doubts and observations. A retired postal worker revealed that he'd been instructed by supervisors to intercept mail addressed to me from certain senders. A former bank employee admitted that she'd been told to report any unusual financial inquiries I might make to family representatives. The scope of the community's unconscious participation in my isolation became clear as more people spoke up. I hadn't just been controlled by the Holloway family, I'd been controlled by an entire social system that deferred to their authority and wealth. But the community response wasn't uniformly supportive. Some residents, particularly those whose families had benefited from Holloway generosity over the years, resented having their comfortable narratives disrupted. Anonymous letters to the newspaper accused me of being ungrateful, of destroying a family that had given so much to the community. The most painful criticism came from people who suggested that I should have let sleeping dogs lie, rather than pursue justice after so many years. These critics argued that reopening old wounds served no purpose other than satisfying my personal desire for revenge. Pastor Williams at the Methodist Church, where James and I had been married, delivered a sermon about forgiveness that was widely interpreted as criticism of my pursuit of justice. "Sometimes," he said, "the Christian response is to forgive past wrongs rather than seek earthly punishment for sins that God has already judged." The sermon sparked a community debate that played out in letters to the editor and heated discussions at town council meetings. Supporters of my actions argued that justice and forgiveness weren't mutually exclusive, that exposing the truth about historical crimes was necessary for genuine healing. Rabbi Sarah Goldstein, whose own grandparents had been victims of wartime persecution, delivered a powerful counter-sermon that was reprinted in the regional newspaper. "Justice delayed is not justice denied," she said. "Mrs. Holloway's courage in seeking truth serves not just her own healing, but the healing of all the families whose suffering was hidden by these lies. We honor the dead, not by preserving comfortable falsehoods, but by ensuring their true stories are finally told." The rabbi's words resonated particularly strongly with the small, Japanese American community, whose families had been affected by the wartime theft. Several families came forward with their own stories of property that had disappeared while their relatives were in internment camps, losses they'd always attributed to wartime chaos rather than systematic theft. Ken Yamamoto, whose grandfather had owned a successful fishing business before the war, testified at a community forum about his family's losses. "We always wondered what happened to my grandfather's boats, his equipment, his savings. The government told us these things were lost during the relocation, but we never believed it. Now we know they were stolen, and the money from selling them helped build the Holloway fortune." The forum, organized by the City Council to address community concerns about the revelations, became a watershed moment for local healing. Family after family stepped forward to share stories of losses during the war, financial hardships that had never been adequately explained, and suspicions that had been dismissed for decades. But perhaps the most significant response came from the local high school, where students had been studying the Holloway case as part of their American history curriculum. Senior Emily Martinez wrote an essay that was published in the school newspaper and later picked up by national media. "Mrs. Holloway's story teaches us that it's never too late to stand up for what's right," Emily wrote. She could have spent her final years quietly, accepting the comfortable lies that had shaped her entire life. Instead, she chose truth over comfort, justice over peace. That takes a kind of courage that most people never have to test. The essay sparked a student-led initiative to rename the James Holloway Memorial Park as the Truth and Justice Memorial Park, honoring not just James's courage in standing up to corruption, but my decision to finish what he'd started. The proposal passed by a 2-to-1 margin in a citywide referendum. The national media attention brought other benefits as well. Historians specializing in World War II corruption reached out to offer assistance in documenting the full scope of the conspiracy James had uncovered. The Smithsonian expressed interest in preserving his evidence as part of their collection on wartime resistance to corruption. Most importantly, other families who suspected they might have been victims of similar conspiracies began coming forward. Agent Reynolds established a tip line that received hundreds of calls from people across the country who had questions about official versions of their relatives' wartime deaths or disappearances. "Your courage has opened the door for other families to seek their own truth," Agent Reynolds told me during one of our final meetings. "The Holloway case is already leading to reopened investigations in 6 other states. You've started something much bigger than you probably realized." As the immediate controversy began to settle, I found myself in an unexpected position of influence and responsibility. Publishers wanted me to write a book about my experience. Documentary filmmakers sought interviews. Universities invited me to speak about justice, perseverance, and the importance of speaking truth to power. But the response that meant the most came from Thomas Garrett, my husband's old friend who had carried James's secret for 73 years. He called me on a quiet Tuesday evening, his voice weak but satisfied. "Margaret," he said, "I can finally rest easy. I kept my promise to Jimmy, and you kept your promise to him. The truth is out, and the bad guys lost. That's all we ever wanted." Thomas died peacefully in his sleep 3 weeks later, his final duty complete. At his funeral, I placed a letter from James on his casket, one of the documents from the safety deposit box where my husband had written about the importance of loyal friends who could be trusted to do the right thing even when it was difficult. Standing at Thomas's graveside, I realized that our small community's struggle to accept the truth about the Holloway family was really a microcosm of a larger challenge facing our entire country. How do we reconcile the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about our past with the more complex, often painful reality of what actually happened? The answer, I'd learned, is that we do it one truth at a time, one brave voice at a time, one person at a time, who decides that justice matters more than comfort. Our town was still healing from the revelations about its founding family, still figuring out how to move forward with a more honest understanding of its history. But that healing was real progress, even if it was uncomfortable. As James had written in one of his final letters, the truth might be painful, but it was always better than a beautiful lie. The final day of the trial brought a sense of completion I'd never expected to experience. After months of testimony, evidence presentation, and legal arguments, the The federal court was ready to render its complete verdict on 73 years of lies and deception. Judge Patricia Hawthorne had presided over the proceedings with remarkable patience and wisdom, ensuring that every aspect of the conspiracy received proper attention as she prepared to announce the court's final rulings on both criminal convictions and civil remedies. The packed courtroom fell into absolute silence. This case represents one of the most comprehensive examples of long-term criminal conspiracy that this court has ever encountered. Judge Hawthorne began. The evidence demonstrates not only the original crimes of treason and murder committed by Charles Holloway in 1941, but a systematic pattern of subsequent crimes designed to conceal those original offenses and exploit their victim's widow for over 7 decades. The judge's words carried the weight of legal authority. But more than that, they carried recognition of the magnitude of what had been done to James and to me. For the first time in 73 years, an official representative of the United States government was acknowledging the truth about my husband's death and my subsequent exploitation. The court finds that James Holloway died as a direct result of his courageous attempts to expose his father's treasonous activities. Judge Hawthorne continued, his murder was not only a crime against him personally, but a crime against the United States of America, as it prevented the disclosure of information that might have saved American lives at Pearl Harbor. The formal recognition of James as a true American hero, rather than the fabricated war victim his family had created, brought tears to my eyes. Finally, his real sacrifice was being acknowledged by the same government he died trying to serve. The criminal sentences had already been announced, but Judge Hawthorne took additional time to explain their significance. Elizabeth Holloway's 15-year sentence reflects not only her participation in the original conspiracy, but her leadership role in maintaining the deception for over 7 decades. Her systematic exploitation of Mrs. Margaret Holloway represents a particularly heinous form of elder abuse that this court cannot overlook. But it was the civil judgment that truly demonstrated the scope of the family's crimes. Judge Hawthorne had ordered a complete forensic accounting of all Holloway family assets, tracing their origins back to the wartime theft and subsequent cover-up. The results were staggering. The court awards Mrs. Margaret Holloway the sum of $67 million in compensatory and punitive damages, the judge announced. This includes the full value of her husband's estate as it would exist today, plus damages for 73 years of fraudulent deprivation, emotional distress, and systematic financial abuse. The number was almost incomprehensible. $6 million more money than I could spend in several lifetimes. Money that represented not just my stolen inheritance but recognition of the decades of suffering I'd endured while the family prospered from their crimes. Additionally, Judge Hawthorne continued, the court orders the establishment of the James Holloway Truth and Justice Foundation, to be funded with an additional $30 million from the Holloway family assets. This foundation will provide support for other families seeking to uncover historical crimes and will fund research into wartime corruption and cover-ups. The foundation had been my idea. Inspired by James's final letter expressing concern for other victims of wartime profiteering, creating it meant that his death would serve a purpose beyond just our personal justice. It would help other families find their own truth, just as I had finally found mine. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause as Judge Hawthorne concluded her remarks. Mrs. Holloway, this court commends your courage in pursuing justice despite the personal cost and the decades of opposition you faced. Your persistence has not only vindicated your husband's memory but has exposed a conspiracy that might otherwise have remained hidden forever. As I left the courthouse that final time, I carried with me more than just legal victory. I carried vindication for James's courage, recognition of my own strength, and hope that other families might find the truth they deserved. Agent Reynolds walked beside me, his expression one of professional satisfaction mixed with personal admiration. Mrs. Holloway, in 30 years of federal law enforcement, I've never seen anyone show more determination or courage than you've demonstrated throughout this investigation. I wasn't alone, I replied, thinking of James's guidance from beyond the grave, Thomas's loyal friendship, and all the people who had supported my quest for truth. Justice isn't something one person achieves alone. It takes a community of people willing to stand up for what's right. The media attention was overwhelming, but I tried to use it constructively. Every interview became an opportunity to talk about the importance of speaking truth to power, of never giving up on justice. even when it seems impossible to achieve. The most meaningful interview was with a young journalist who asked what I'd learned from my experience. I learned that truth has its own power, I said. Lies require constant energy to maintain, but truth sustains itself. Eventually, if enough people have the courage to speak it, truth will always win. That evening alone, in my car, I now owned outright for the first time in 73 years. I sat with James's final letter one more time. His words about believing that justice would eventually prevail had proved prophetic. But it had taken longer than either of us could have imagined. I looked at his photograph on my mantel, the young soldier who died trying to do the right thing, and spoke to him as if he were sitting beside me. We did it, James. We finished what you started. The truth is out. The bad guys are in prison, and your real story is finally being told. I kept my promise to you, and you kept yours too. You were right that I was stronger than I knew. Outside my window, the harbor where Charles Holloway had once run his criminal empire was quiet in the evening light. Ships still came and went, carrying legitimate cargo for honest purposes. The corruption that had once infected our community was gone, replaced by a harder but healthier understanding of our own history. Justice had been served, not just for James and me, but for all the families whose suffering had been hidden by the Holloway lies. The truth was finally free, and so was I. The bronze memorial plaque arrived on a crisp October morning, 6 months after the trial's conclusion. As I unwrapped it carefully, reading the words that would finally tell James's true story, I felt a profound sense of completion that had eluded me for over 7 decades. Lieutenant James Edward Holloway, the plaque read, 1919 to 1941, died courageously fighting corruption and treason, murdered while attempting to prevent enemy attacks on American forces, a true American hero whose sacrifice for truth and justice was hidden for 73 years but will never be forgotten. The memorial service at the Harbor Park drew hundreds of people from across the state. Veterans organizations sent honor guards, historians came to document James's real story, and families of other wartime victims attended to show solidarity with the pursuit of historical truth. But the moment that meant the most to me was when Thomas Garrett's grandson stepped forward to read his grandfather's final letter about his friendship with James. My grandfather wrote this just before he died, young Michael Garrett said, his voice carrying across the quiet gathering. He wanted everyone to know that James Holloway was the finest man he ever knew, and that Mrs. Holloway's fight for justice honored both her husband's memory and the principle that truth is worth whatever it costs to defend. The letter brought tears to many eyes, but for me it represented something more: the completion of a circle that began with 2 young soldiers making promises to each other in 1941. Thomas had kept his promise to James. I had kept my promise to both of them, and now the truth was preserved for future generations. The healing process hadn't been easy. 73 years of believing one story about your life doesn't change overnight, even when you learn that story was a lie. I'd spent months in therapy with Dr. Chen, working through the complex emotions of grief, anger, betrayal, and ultimately, acceptance. You're not just mourning James's death, Dr. Chen had explained during one of our sessions. You're mourning the life you should have had, the woman you might have become if you'd known the truth from the beginning. That's a unique form of grief that requires time to process. The therapy helped me understand that my anger toward the Holloway family was justified and healthy, but that carrying it indefinitely would only continue their work of diminishing my life. Forgiveness, Dr. Chen taught me, wasn't about excusing their crimes. It was about freeing myself from the emotional burden of hating them. The process was gradual and sometimes painful. I had to learn to forgive not just the Holloways, but myself for not questioning their story more aggressively, for accepting their financial control, for spending so many years living the role they'd written for me instead of writing my own story. But with healing came unexpected opportunities. The James Holloway Truth and Justice Foundation was already helping other families uncover historical crimes and cover-ups. We'd received over 300 inquiries from families across the country who suspected their own loved ones had been victims of wartime profiteering or corruption. One of our first major cases involved a family in Oregon whose grandfather had supposedly died in a training accident in 1943. Our investigators discovered that he'd actually been murdered. After discovering evidence of military contract fraud, a case remarkably similar to James's story, the family had spent 80 years believing their grandfather died clumsily, They deserved to know he'd died heroically. Working with these families gave my life a purpose I'd never experienced before. For the first time in decades, I was helping other people instead of being someone who needed help. The role reversal was both empowering and healing, allowing me to transform my own suffering into service for others. The foundation also funded historical research into wartime corruption, supporting scholars who were documenting the broader patterns of profiteering and cover-ups that had characterized the World War II era. Dr. Michael Chen, who had written about the Holloway family's philanthropy scheme, received a substantial grant to study similar cases nationwide. Your husband's documentation was so thorough that it's helping us understand how these conspiracies operated. Dr. Chen told me during a foundation meeting, James wasn't just exposing his father's crimes, he was exposing an entire system of corruption that affected thousands of families. Perhaps the most healing aspect of my new life was the relationships I was finally free to build. For 73 years, the Holloway family had carefully managed my social connections, discouraging friendships that might lead to uncomfortable questions about my situation. Now, at 73, I was making real friends for the first time since my marriage. The foundation's board included several remarkable women who had fought their own battles for justice and truth. Eleanor Vasquez, whose family had been cheated out of their farm during the war, became a close friend and advisor. Sarah Kim, whose grandmother had lost everything during the Japanese internment, helped design the foundation's victim support programs. That these women understood what I'd experienced in ways that most people couldn't. They knew what it felt like to discover that everything you'd believed about your family's history was a lie. What it took to fight powerful people who wanted to keep uncomfortable truths buried. What it meant to find justice after decades of being told to move on and let go. The friendship I treasured most was with Margaret Holloway Davidson, James's cousin who had cooperated with the federal investigation. After her sentencing to probation in community service, she'd reached out to apologize for her family's crimes, and to ask if there was any way she could help make amends. Our first meeting was awkward and painful, but Margaret's genuine remorse and her willingness to face uncomfortable truths about her family gradually built trust between us. She became one of the foundation's most effective advocates, using her insider knowledge of the Holloway conspiracy to help other families understand how such cover-ups operated. "I can't undo what my family did to you," Margaret told me during one of our monthly lunches, "but I can spend whatever time I have left helping other families avoid what you went through." Her transformation from unwitting co-conspirator to justice advocate demonstrated something I'd learned throughout this entire experience. People can change, families can heal, and even the worst situations can eventually lead to something positive if we have the courage to face the truth. The cottage that had been my prison for so many years became a place of genuine peace and happiness. I redecorated it to reflect my own tastes rather than the Holloway family's preferences, filled it with books and artwork that I chose, and opened it to friends and colleagues who appreciated its history and my journey. Standing in my garden on the anniversary of James's real death, December 3rd, not December 7th, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete peace with both the past and the future. James's true story was finally being told, justice had been served, and I was finally free to live the rest of my life on my own terms. The young woman who had married James Holloway in 1941 had been naive and trusting, dependent on others to define her worth and her story. The woman I'd become was independent, strong, and committed to helping others find their own truth and justice. It had taken 73 years, but I'd finally grown into the person James always believed I could become. At 74, I discovered that life can begin again at any age if you have the courage to write a new chapter. The manuscript I'd been working on for the past year lay spread across my dining table, page after page of my story, from the naive young bride who'd married James Holloway to the woman who'd finally found the strength to seek justice. 7 decades later, the publisher who'd approached me about writing a memoir had expected a simple story of personal triumph over adversity. What they received was something more complex: meditation on truth, justice, the corrosive effects of lies, and the power of persistence in the face of seemingly impossible odds. "Your story isn't just about your family," my editor, Sarah Chun's daughter, as it turned out, told me during one of our revision sessions. "It's about how ordinary people can find extraordinary courage when they're finally ready to stop accepting comfortable lies and start demanding uncomfortable truths." The book, Titled Truth Above All, the words from James's grandmother's locket that I still wore every day was scheduled for publication on December 7th, Pearl Harbor Day. The symbolism felt appropriate, honoring both the real heroes who died that day and the memory of a young man who tried to prevent their deaths. But the memoir was just one part of the new life I was building. The James Holloway Truth and Justice Foundation had grown beyond my wildest expectations, with offices in 3 states and a staff of investigators, researchers, and victim advocates who were helping families across the country uncover long truths about their own histories. Our most recent success involved a family in Texas whose father had supposedly died in a Jeep accident in 1944. Foundation investigators discovered that he'd actually been murdered after threatening to expose a military contracting scandal that had cost American lives in the Pacific Theater. Like James, he'd been a whistleblower whose death was disguised as an accident to protect the criminals he'd been trying to stop. Every case we solve is a victory for James's memory, I told the Foundation's board during our quarterly meeting. He died believing that truth would eventually prevail, and every family we help proves he was right. The Foundation had also become a resource for historians and journalists investigating other wartime conspiracies. Our research had contributed to congressional hearings on historical military corruption, helped families recover stolen property worth millions of dollars, and exposed cover-ups that had hidden crimes for over 80 years. But perhaps most importantly, the Foundation had become a symbol of hope for people who thought it was too late to seek justice for historical wrongs. Our case files included families who'd been waiting 60, 70, even 80 years for someone to take their concerns seriously. "You've shown that it's never too late to fight for truth," wrote one grandmother whose family had finally learned the real circumstances of her brother's wartime death. "My children and grandchildren know now that their uncle was a hero, not a casualty of careless training. That knowledge has healed wounds in our family that we didn't even know existed." The speaking engagements that had begun during the trial had evolved into a regular part of my life. Universities invited me to lecture about persistence and justice. Veterans organizations asked me to speak about honoring the real sacrifices of military service. Victim advocacy groups wanted to hear about the importance of never giving up on truth. The most meaningful speaking engagement was at the FBI Academy, where Agent Reynolds had arranged for me to address new federal investigators about the importance of taking seriously cases that others might dismiss as ancient history or family disputes. "The Holloway case taught us that some crimes don't have expiration dates," I told the young agents. "Truth doesn't become less important just because it's been hidden for decades. Your willingness to investigate cases that others consider too old or too complicated might be the only hope some families have for justice." Agent Reynolds, who had become a close friend during our long investigation, introduced me as one of the most persistent and courageous people I've ever had the privilege to work with. His words meant more to me than any official recognition, coming from someone who'd seen firsthand what it had taken to expose the truth about James's death. The personal relationships that had grown from my quest for justice were among the most precious aspects of my new life. Eleanor Vasquez and I had become so close that people sometimes mistook us for sisters. Bonded by our shared experience of fighting powerful families who'd stolen from us for decades, Sarah Kim had become like a daughter to me, seeking my advice on everything from Foundation business to her own family relationships. Even my relationship with Margaret Holloway Davidson had deepened into genuine friendship. Her transformation from reluctant witness to passionate advocate for justice had been remarkable to watch, and her insights into how wealthy families manipulated institutions and individuals had proved invaluable to the Foundation's work. "I spent most of my life enabling lies," Margaret told me during one of our recent conversations. "Working with the Foundation gives me a chance to spend whatever time I have left promoting truth instead." The cottage that had once felt like a prison had become a gathering place for friends, colleagues, and fellow advocates for justice. My living room hosted Foundation planning meetings, my kitchen fed investigative teams working on complex cases, and my garden provided a peaceful space for families to process difficult revelations about their own histories. But it was the quiet moments alone that brought me the most satisfaction. Sitting in my favorite chair, reading James's letters by lamplight, I felt his presence more clearly than I had since the early days of our marriage. The young woman who'd been too naive to question the Holloway family's lies had grown into someone who could honor his memory properly. The final chapter of my memoir ended with a letter to James, words I'd been wanting to say to him for 73 years, but had never had the chance to speak. My dearest husband, I wrote, I kept my promise to you. I found the truth you died trying to expose. I finished the fight you started, and I made sure your real story would never be forgotten. You were right about me. I was stronger than either of us knew. You were right about truth. It did eventually prevail. And you were right about justice. It was worth whatever it cost to achieve. I'm not the same frightened young woman you married in 1941. Life and loss and the long fight for justice have changed me in ways we never could have anticipated. But I'm still the woman who loves you, who believes in the principles you died defending, and who will spend whatever time I have left making sure your sacrifice means something. The war you started against corruption and lies is finally over. And just as you always believed it would, truth won in the end. Looking out my window at the harbor where Charles Holloway had once run his criminal empire, I no longer saw a place of past trauma, but a symbol of transformation. The water that had carried stolen goods now carried legitimate cargo. The docks that had witnessed treason now supported honest trade. The community that had been built on lies was learning to build its future on truth. At 74. I was finally free to be the woman James had always believed I could become: strong, independent, dedicated to justice, and committed to helping others find their own courage to fight for truth. My story wasn't ending. It was just beginning. And somewhere, I knew James was proud of the woman his young bride had finally grown up to be. If you've ever felt silenced by those who should protect you, like this video.